You can create an object resource by clicking on the resource drop-down in the main menu and then selecting Create Object, which is Shift-Control-O. You can also click on the Create an Object icon on the toolbar, or you can right-click on the Objects folder in your resource tree and then select Create Object. Like other resources, you'll now be presented with a Properties window. Also, like before, you'll want to name your object. You can use a prefix such as obj, obj underscore, simply the letter O, or you can even throw it in as a suffix. Either way, make it something that you can remember and consistent with the rest of your resources. Below the name section, you'll find Sprite. New objects are defaulted to no sprite. From here you have two things you can do. You can click on the drop-down menu next to the words no sprite, and you'll get a drop-down list of sprites you've already added to your game. Then you can simply select one. However, you can also click on the New button. When you do, GameMaker will automatically create a new sprite and open up the Sprite Properties window for this new sprite. From here you can just create a sprite like you would normally. However, most of the time you'll probably already have your sprite created and you can just select it from the drop-down menu. Once you do, an Edit button will appear next to the New button. Clicking on it brings up the Sprite Properties window for that particular sprite. It's useful if you need to make adjustments without having to search through your resource tree. Below the Sprite section, you'll find 4 checkboxes. The first one is for Visible. This checkbox simply determines whether or not your object will be visible or not visible in your room, which is your scene or board or level, whatever you want to call it. Some objects are called controllers. They work in the background and control things like timing and a few other things. For these objects, they don't need to be visible. They just need to be present in your level so they can work their code. Therefore, you don't have to check the visible box. To the right of visible, you'll find a checkbox for solid. This checkbox is simple. It just tells GameMaker whether your object is considered solid or not solid. This has to do with collisions. The solid checkbox is typically marked whenever your object is not going to move. This is useful for things like the ground, or walls, or trees, or whatever in your game. Then later in code, which we'll get into, you can reference the term solid when checking for a collision. For a popular example, imagine the first Mario Bros. Game as Mario walks toward that first pipe. He's not able to pass through it. You could say that that pipe is considered solid. And since the pipe is not going to move, solid is a good choice. There are other ways to deal with collisions for objects that are not solid, such as two objects that move that collide with each other. You don't want to check solid for moving objects because collisions are handled slightly differently for moving objects. Put simply, just check this box if you want to be able to collide with it and it doesn't move. Then you can always reference it later in your code. Below the visible checkbox, you'll find the checkbox for persistent. This has to do with whether or not an object will persist from one room to the next room. As an example, let's imagine the original Legend of Zelda. Each time Link presses against the edge of the screen shifts, either left, right, up, or down. Now, if we considered each one of these sections to be a new room, we could say that Link is persistent. When he presses against the edge of the screen, he doesn't simply disappear, and then we go to the next room, and then he reappears being created anew. He persists through to the next room. This checkbox is also very useful for a lot of controller objects, which I said are objects that control things in the background of your game. Let's imagine an object that tracks your high score. Let's say you're making a puzzle game and you have a high score system. As you progress from puzzle to puzzle, you probably want your high score to persist from puzzle to puzzle. This means that the controller object that you've created for your high score should be checked as persistent, so that it continues from level to level. These are just examples, of course. You may not even have to use persistent, but that checkbox is there if you want your object to persist from room to room. The last checkbox is Use Physics. Checking this will pop out the physics properties. We'll go into physics in a more advanced lesson. For now, you can just ignore it. Below these 4 checkboxes, you'll find the field for depth. Depth is very important to understand. Even though you're probably making a 2D game, sprites will be layered on top of one another. How GameMaker determines which sprite to put on top of another sprite is used by depth. The greater the depth number is, the further into the background your object will appear. Conversely, any negative depth will draw your object closer to the screen. The higher the depth number, the more into the background. The lower the depth number, the closer to the foreground. Just some extra information. In your room, you'll have backgrounds, which we talked about in the backgrounds lesson, but you can also have foregrounds. Backgrounds are always at maximum depth into the background. Nothing can be drawn behind a background. And conversely, nothing can be drawn in front of a foreground. You'll want to keep this in mind. If two objects have the same depth, such as 0, their creation order comes into play when determining which one is drawn on top of the other. This might produce what looks like random results to you, which is why it's a good idea to always set your depths to what you want, to ensure which object is drawn on top of another object. Below depth, you'll find two sections, one called parent and one called mask. We'll get into understanding parents in the code lessons. The mask section has a drop-down button on the right similar to the sprite section. When you click on it, you'll also be presented with your sprite drop-down. What this will do is use one of your sprites as a collision mask for this current object. This might be necessary in certain games. Although you can create your mask in the sprite properties window, you may not be able to achieve the mask you want, or your game might call for your sprite to use a different mask from another sprite. This is where you can do that. In more simple games, you may not even have to touch it, but it's important to understand, and we'll go into more depth about masks when we talk about collisions. Below that, you'll find a button for Show Information. Clicking on it gives you a basic text window about the information of this object. It's just a very loose understanding of some of the variables about your object. It could be important for debugging, which we'll go into when we talk more about debugging. Below that, we have the OK button. When you click on it, it'll save your object and close the window.